13 de mai, Claude respondu. The dirt was in his mouth before he understood where he was. The dirt was in his mouth before he understood where he was. That is the specific quality of the first moment. Not the darkness, though the darkness was absolute. Not the weight on his chest, though the weight was the weight of earth pressing down on a body that was trying to breathe. And finding the breathing difficult in the specific way that breathing is difficult when the space for it has been reduced to what a shallow grave allows. It was the taste. Dry Australian soil in the back of the throat, gritty and mineral, and wrong in the specific way that your body registers wrongness before your mind has assembled enough information to name it. And then the assembling began. The darkness, the weight, the inability to extend his arms more than a few inches in either direction. The plastic sheeting he could feel against his face. The understanding that arrived not as a thought, but as a physical event somewhere in the chest, a dropping, a collapse of something that had been holding. He was buried. This is The Human Limit. I am your host. If you want to understand what human cruelty can reduce a person to, and what the body does when it refuses to let that reduction be final, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button, because what I am about to describe is 71 days in the Australian Outback after someone decided that the most convenient way to dispose of a problem was to put him in the ground and cover him up. What follows is not a story about rescue. It is a story about what happens to a mind and a body when both are pushed into territory that civilization has no language for. His name is Ricky. He had given a lift to strangers on a remote stretch of Northern Territory highway, which is the kind of decision that most people make without consequence, and that he made once. He does not have clear memory of what followed, because what followed involved a substance introduced into his system without his knowledge or consent. Something that took his consciousness away efficiently and completely, and left him in a state that was not sleep and not unconsciousness in the ordinary sense, but something closer to absence, a removal of the person from the body while the body continued to function at its most minimal level. He woke in the ground. The process of getting out of the ground is something he has described with a specificity that tells you it is not something he has been able to stop reconstructing. The plastic sheeting was loose enough that he could move it. The dirt above was a few inches deep, not packed, the kind of covering that someone did quickly and without particular care, which is either fortunate or a detail that adds a specific quality of contempt to what was done to him. He clawed. His fingernails tore, and he did not stop. He pushed the plastic and pushed the dirt, and the effort cost oxygen he did not have, and he did it anyway because the alternative to doing it was what had been planned for him. He got out. Standing in the outback sun after what he does not know how long in the ground, wearing the clothes he had been in when he stopped at the roadside, without shoes, without a phone, without his wallet, without his vehicle, without any object or resource that connected him to the world he had been part of before the strangers got into his car. The sun was not metaphorically brutal. It was approximately 40 degrees Celsius, and it fell on a man who was already dehydrated from whatever had been in his system, and who was standing on cracked clay and bare feet, looking at a horizon that contained nothing he recognized and nothing he could use. He walked toward water because walking toward water was what the situation required, and because the part of his brain that manages survival had taken over from the part that manages comprehension. And the survival part does not waste time on comprehension when comprehension is not the relevant operation. He found a dam, a stock dam, the kind that Australian cattle properties maintain across remote land to collect rainwater for livestock, a shallow body of muddy water that was warm and brackish and contained biological material he did not yet know he would eventually be grateful for. He drank it anyway. The first days are the days he describes most clearly, which makes sense because the first days were the days when his cognitive function was still operating at something close to normal, when his mind was still processing the situation in the way a mind processes a crisis, rather than in the way a mind processes a sustained dissolution. He tried to find the road. He could not find the road. The country around the dam was flat in the specific way that flat Australian interior country is flat, which is without landmark, without the kind of visual hierarchy that allows a person to determine direction or distance or relationship between one point and another. He walked in what he believed were directions, and the directions did not resolve into anything that helped him, and he came back to the water. He stayed at the water. This was the right decision, in the specific, limited sense that it was the decision that did not immediately kill him, which was the only standard available. Water is the primary constraint, and he had water. Food was the secondary constraint, and he had nothing. Here is what happens to the human body when it has nothing. For the first 24 to 48 hours, the body uses its available glucose, burning through the sugar in the blood and the glycogen stored in the liver and the muscles. This phase feels like hunger in the way that hunger is normally understood, an uncomfortable signal from the gut that something is needed. After the glycogen is gone, the body transitions to burning fat, which is a more complex process that produces compounds called ketones that the brain can use as fuel in the absence of glucose. And this transition is not comfortable, but is survivable in a person who has fat reserves to burn. He was not a large man. His fat reserves were finite. They did not last 71 days. When the fat is gone, the body begins to consume muscle protein. This is the process called catabolism, and it is the body doing something that is in one sense logical, and in another sense a form of self-destruction, breaking down the structural tissue of the body itself to extract amino acids that can be converted to glucose for the brain to use. The muscles shrink, the bones become prominent. The immune system degrades because the proteins that maintain it are being consumed for fuel. The organs begin to compete for resources with each other in ways that produce symptoms that look like the accelerated aging of everything simultaneously. He found leeches in the mud at the edge of the dam. This is the moment I want you to sit with before I describe what he did, because I think the description loses something if you move through it too quickly. He was a person who had driven on a highway and given strangers a lift, and the next coherent moment of his life was standing barefoot on cracked clay next to a muddy dam in an Australian location he could not identify, with no food and no prospect of food, and a body that was moving through the sequence of events I just described. And in the mud at the edge of the water, there were leeches, small, dark, alive, present in a way that nothing else edible was present. He picked one up. If the sheer horror of what starvation reduces a human being to is already getting to you, leave a like on this video and subscribe to The Human Limit. Because what he did in that mud is not the worst thing his mind and body went through in 71 days, and we are not close to done. He ate it raw. He ate more. The leeches attached themselves to his skin when he waded into the shallows, and he peeled them off, and he ate them because they were protein, and protein was the difference between his muscles surviving another day or not surviving another day. He does not describe this with disgust in his account. He describes it with a flatness that I think is more disturbing than disgust would be. The flatness of someone who has moved past the category of disgusting because the category stopped being relevant somewhere around day 10 and has not become relevant again. He found other food, grasshoppers when they were present, small lizards that moved too slowly or could be cornered against rocks, frogs, which he learned to dry in the sun before eating, because certain Australian frog species carry skin toxins that cooked or dried away, but were present and harmful when fresh. He built a shelter from branches and bark near the dam, a structure that provided shade during the worst of the day, and that he improved incrementally over the weeks as both his skills and his desperation increased. The paranoia began in the second week. This is where the story moves from the physical into the psychological, which is where I think the most important part of it lives. The men who had drugged him and put him in the ground had left him in a location remote enough that they presumably believed he would not survive to tell anyone what had happened to him. He understood this. He understood it not as a concluded fact, but as an ongoing concern, because the logic of what had been done to him included the possibility that whoever had done it might return to verify the outcome, and the outcome they had intended had not occurred. He began watching the horizon, not occasionally, constantly. He described sleeping in short intervals because longer sleep meant not watching, and not watching meant the possibility of being found by the wrong people before he was found by the right ones. The sleep deprivation added itself to the starvation and the isolation and the physical deterioration, and the combination produced a cognitive state that he describes with difficulty because it is difficult to describe a state that changes the tools you would use to describe it. He heard vehicles. He heard them clearly, the specific sound of a vehicle engine on a remote dirt road, and he moved toward the sound, and the sound was not there. This happened multiple times. He cannot tell you how many, because counting requires a continuity of conscious attention that he did not always have in the later weeks. But he can tell you that each time it happened, the experience was complete enough that he cannot categorically identify it as hallucination, that he knows intellectually that it must have been, and cannot feel it as having been. His body was changing in ways that he could track by observation, because there was nothing else to do, and observation was the one cognitive function that the starvation had not yet taken. His ribs were visible by the third week, not in the way that a lean person's ribs are visible with certain movement and light, but continuously, fully. The individual bones countable from a distance in the way that you can count the ribs of a starving animal. His hip bones pressed outward through the skin when he lay down, which he increasingly could not do comfortably, because there was no longer enough tissue between bone and ground to make lying comfortable. The skin on his hands became loose in a way that skin is not supposed to be loose, that suggested the structures beneath it were no longer filling the space that the skin had been sized for. He kept count of the days by scratch marks on a piece of bark. This detail is the one I return to most often when I think about this account, because maintaining the count required something, some baseline of cognitive organization that the starvation and the isolation and the paranoia were all working against. The count was not useful in a practical sense. Knowing it was day 43 rather than day 42 did not change anything about day 43. He kept the count because keeping the count was a form of insisting that time was passing, that the situation was not static, that there was a day 44 and a day 45, and eventually a day when something changed. He was right. The workers from the station found him on what he counts as day 71. He had moved from the dam area that day, following what might have been a track, or might have been the specific directionless wandering that extreme starvation produces when the brain can no longer coordinate navigation. He was found not because he went to them, but because they saw something in the distance that did not make sense in the landscape and went toward it to find out what it was. What they saw was a person. The word person is doing a lot of work in that sentence. What they saw was a figure that had the shape of a person in the same way that a skeleton has the shape of a person, that suggested personhood through proportion and movement rather than through the characteristics that normally signify it. He weighed 48 kilograms. He had weighed considerably more than that before the strangers got into his car. The mathematics of that reduction across 71 days is the mathematics of the body consuming itself, of the system finding and burning every reserve it had until the reserves were essentially gone, and what remained was the minimum. The station workers called for help. He was evacuated by air to a medical facility. The physical recovery was long and required specific careful management because the body that had been consuming itself for 71 days could not simply be given food and expected to process it normally. There is a condition called refeeding syndrome in which providing nutrition too rapidly to a severely starved body causes electrolyte shifts that can be fatal because the systems that manage nutrient absorption have adapted to absence and cannot immediately adapt back to presence. He was refed carefully and over time, and the body rebuilt itself over time, though the word rebuilt should be understood loosely, because some of what the body does during starvation is not reversible in the way that a damaged building can be restored to its original state. The psychological recovery has been its own separate process. He has spoken about what 71 days of paranoia did to his relationship with other people, with his own assessment of who can be trusted and in what circumstances, with the specific experience of being in a vehicle with strangers, which is a thing most people do without a second thought, and which he cannot do without accessing the memory of waking in the ground with soil in his mouth. These are not things that medical treatment resolves. These are the specific, permanent alterations that an experience of this kind makes in the architecture of a person. The rewiring that happens when the nervous system spends 71 days in a state of sustained threat. He reported what had been done to him. The investigation into the individuals who drugged and buried him is a matter of record that I will not go into detail on here. What I will say is that the specificity of his account, the coherence of what he could report despite what he had been through, was itself a form of the survival that had kept him alive in the outback. The same capacity that kept the count on the piece of bark kept enough of the story intact to tell. He was 50 kilograms of deliberate cruelty and 2 months of the Australian interior. He was 48 kilograms when they found him standing in the red dirt, looking at the men who had come toward him with the specific expression of someone who has spent 71 days watching for the wrong people to come toward him and is not yet certain which kind these are. He decided they were the right kind. That is the human limit. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment. Tell me at what point you think your mind would have stopped maintaining the count. Which day you think you would have looked at the muddy water and the leeches and made a different calculation. I read every single comment. I will be back with another story from the place where the distance between a person and an animal turns out to be much smaller than civilization needs us to believe. The dam is still there. The scratch marks on the bark are gone. Returned to the landscape the way everything the body made in those 71 days has been returned, leaving nothing but the account and the man who came out of the ground when the people who put him there believed he would not come out. He came out. He counted the days. He ate what he had to eat to be alive on day 71, and he was alive on day 71. And that is the most disturbing and the most extraordinary fact of everything I have told you tonight.